Hey, Markham Woods Church family. It's Pastor Joe, just giving you a bit of a little Thursday morning devotional time. If you care to watch along, read along, pray along, meditate along. So I hope you're doing well. We are making progress. It looks like things are slowly starting to come back to life, but not all the way. We can't hold our public worship yet. That seems to be weeks away. So for many of you, you're watching virtually. You're maybe watching these devotionals, and you're connecting. We are connecting, even though we're not maybe physically together. We are certainly spiritually together and faithfully together. But as this thing has continued on, I was just thinking the other day, I was working on a newsletter article and just considering where we are today. And it seems to me that for many of us in businesses and churches, anything that has to do with people, that's like everything, right? But it's a bit like we're in a period of exile. You know, we're just exiled from a lot of the things that we like to do. So we tried to go hiking the other day to a park, and the park was shut down. We're even exiled from parks. We're exiled from, I tried to find a tennis court, exiled from tennis courts, exiled from public worship, exiled from some of our favorite restaurants, exiled from family members, exiled from our ability to do what we normally do to make a living. So this is a condition that the people of God have experienced before. We have a heritage. We have a rich heritage. It goes, that Judeo-Christian kind of heritage where we have kindred brothers and sisters in the Hebrew faith that understand so deeply about exile. And as I thought about that, of being kind of locked down, a song came to me. And it's a song we used to sing back in the Young Life days, and maybe some of you folks sang it also in kind of the folk uprising or evolution or emerging Christian folk worship that happened in the early 70s. I remember we used to gather in coffee houses and play guitar and sing Christian folk songs. And we sang a particular song that's where my mind went when I began thinking about exile. It's called "By the Waters of Babylon." So I wanted to give you a little, I'm going to give you a little taste of this. I hope you can hear it. So do you remember that tune? Do you remember that little piece of music? Maybe you sang it too. We used to do it in rounds, right? We get three different groups and sing it as a round. The song is referring to an actual song. It's Psalm 137 in the Old Testament. Psalm 137 actually says, "By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and we wept. When we remembered Zion, we hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof, for there they carried us away to captivity." So the psalmist is singing about that time when the kingdom of, the southern kingdom of Judah is carried off in what we call the Babylonian exile, right? Or Babylonian captivity. They're carried off, and it's in that little area where the Tigris and Euphrates come together today. You can find that. You can find that on your map in Iraq. So they're carried off, and they're in exile. They're longing to be returned to their normal life, and so they're singing these songs of lament. By the waters of Babylon, we lay down and we wept. So it's we may be weeping a bit ourselves today. Maybe our waters of Babylon look a little bit different, but it doesn't always mean that God is not present with us. God is not working out God's purposes with us, as God was not vacant from those folks in exile. Sometimes they thought so. They thought, where's God in the midst of all of this? We're in exile, we're in Babylon, and the temple's been destroyed. But something very curious happens, and I wrote about this in my upcoming newsletter article. Being in exile actually triggered some things today that we take for granted. When Jerusalem was conquered, the temple was completely destroyed and the people carted off. So temple worship was the center of that Jewish faith. We know that coming to the temple and offering sacrifice, that was the worship. That's how the Hebrew people were expressing their faith in God through that ritual that would take place. And it was taken away. They're in Babylon. There's no temple. What do you do? Can you think about today? What do you do? No church building. We can't go into the building right now. How do we do this thing? How do we do this worship? How do we continue to be faithful people when we're exiled out of the place where we seem to go to get that? So that's what the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, were experiencing. And so out of that came some very really neat creativity. They began to learn that faith in God and God's people didn't have to revolve exactly in the temple. And so they began to do worship differently. And what grew out of this was gathering together in groups, small groups, and worshiping. So when the people came back they were returned out of exile, they go back to Israel, they go back to the what we call today the Holy Land. Worship took on a different form. It wasn't just in the temple. There was this new thing called synagogues. Right? We take that for granted today. They're everywhere, synagogues. So synagogue actually means assembly. That's what the real word means. And so it's the belief is that in exile, people began to gather together, to assemble together. And maybe some of the first synagogues were just gathering of people in small groups. Sound familiar? Small groups together to act as the people of God, to worship, to tell the stories, to pray. And so when they came back, that synagogue tradition developed, and yes, eventually it developed into buildings. And so we even hear that when Jesus traveled to Galilee, it said he preached in all the synagogues in the Galilee. So, what was a gathering of people became sort of institutionalized into buildings, and we have those even down to today. So out of exile, God's people got very creative and found ways to continue worship through new technology, right? The new technology of the day, gathering, assembling together in small groups, synagogue. So today we're doing a bit of that. We're actually reliving, and this is kind of neat. It gives us a way to put ourselves into the position of those people that we read the stories about all the time. And the stories aren't just history. As I always say, the stories they're today. So we are the modern exiles. We have found new ways to worship, haven't we? Right now through something just like this. So many of you are watching our live stream. So we're worshiping. It's not just about the building, right? You can't be in the building, but the worship continues. Worship hasn't ceased. I saw somebody hawking a book on TV this morning. They're talking about David Wilkerson, kind of an evangelical type, and he had a ministry, wrote books, but he made a prophecy, and his prophecy that in the future that bars would close and churches would shut down because of a new plague that would run the earth. And so the illusion is that plague is coronavirus. I don't know about that. But I don't think his prophecy fits, because maybe bars have shut down, but churches haven't shut down. In exile, temple worship shut down, but the people of God continue to worship. So we may not be in a building, but the church never stopped. You never stopped being the church. We are worshiping still. We have become synagogues, right? Groups gather together. Might be gathered through Zoom, might be gathered together through the internet, texting, all kinds of formats. The synagogue looks a little different today, but God's people have always found that creative edge. And we continue to do that. So I just want to give you that little word today as we think about being by the waters of Babylon. It doesn't really matter about the geography, right? It doesn't matter about the physical location of the building. We've said this so many times, and maybe today it takes on a new meaning. The church is not the building. We always said that, but now we know it. We know the church works. The church is worshiping even right now. So that's kind of a new way to think about things today as we move forward, because one day we'll be back in the building, but the church never stopped, never shut down. So there's a good word for you today. I hope you'll check in with us on our live feeds. We'll be worshiping at 9 and 11. I know a lot of you, we've been looking at the analytics, and you worship a little bit later, maybe the next day, and that's telling us something too, that worship doesn't always happen at a particular hour. Worship can happen whenever the people of God get together like they did in exile, like they did in the synagogue movement back in the Old Testament days. So I hope you'll keep checking in with us on that. Have some good news. I'll be reporting to you about some more feeding programs that we're going to be doing, but that's for another time. So again, blessings from Pastor Joe at Markham Woods Presbyterian Church.